Sarah Martinez had dreamed of this day since she was 7 years old. Standing in front of the full-length mirror in the bridal suite of the Grand Oak Manor, she smoothed down the delicate lace of her grandmother's wedding dress. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting golden light across the room where her bridesmaids bustled around, putting finishing touches on their makeup and adjusting their lavender dresses. "You look absolutely stunning," whispered her maid of honor, Jessica, as she fastened the pearl necklace that had been in Sarah's family for 3 generations. The same necklace her grandmother had worn when she married Sarah's grandfather in 1952, and her mother had worn in 1978. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to calm the butterflies dancing in her stomach. After 5 years of dating, she and David were finally tying the knot. They had met during their senior year of college, and their love had grown stronger through graduate school, career changes, and all the challenges that life had thrown their way. The venue was perfect. Grand Oak Manor sat on 50 acres of rolling hills with ancient oak trees providing natural canopies over the ceremony site. White chairs were arranged in neat rows on the emerald lawn, with a beautiful archway covered in white roses and baby's breath marking the altar. 200 guests would witness their union, including family members who had traveled from across the country. What made this day even more special was that Sarah and David had chosen to honor their family's military traditions. David's father was a retired Navy captain, while Sarah's older brother had served 2 tours in Afghanistan as an Army Ranger. The ceremony would include a military sword arch, performed by David's groomsmen, who were all active-duty servicemen. As Sarah put on her white satin shoes, she reflected on how far she had come. Growing up in a small military town in Texas, she had always been surrounded by stories of courage and service. Her father, a career soldier, had taught her and her brother how to handle firearms, basic self-defense, and survival skills from a young age. "You never know when life might test you," he used to say during their weekend camping trips in the hill country. After high school, Sarah had surprised everyone by choosing a different path. Instead of following her family's military tradition, she pursued a degree in elementary education. She wanted to shape young minds and make a difference in children's lives. However, her father's lessons had stayed with her. She maintained her physical fitness, practiced at the shooting range monthly, and even took advanced martial arts classes during college. Her bridesmaids chatted excitedly about the reception. The manor's ballroom had been transformed into a fairy tale setting with crystal chandeliers, flowing white curtains, and centerpieces of white lilies and eucalyptus. A 12-piece band would provide music for dancing, and the 3-tier vanilla cake with buttercream roses sat waiting in the adjacent room. "The photographer wants to start with some individual shots before we head down," Jessica announced, checking her phone. "He said the light is perfect right now." Sarah nodded, taking one final look in the mirror. Her dark hair was styled in an elegant updo with small white flowers woven throughout. Her makeup was flawless but natural, highlighting her brown eyes and giving her cheeks a soft, rosy glow. She had chosen simple diamond earrings, a gift from David on their 4th anniversary. Outside, she could hear the soft sounds of guests arriving. Car doors closing, laughter, and the gentle melody of the string quartet that was providing prelude music. The ceremony wasn't scheduled to begin for another 2 hours, but early arrivals always came to enjoy the grounds and take photos. David was getting ready in a separate wing of the manor with his groomsmen. Sarah smiled, thinking about how nervous he probably was right now. Despite his confidence in everything else, he had been anxiously planning every detail of this day for months. He had even practiced his vows in front of the bathroom mirror every morning for the past 2 weeks. The photographer knocked on the door and entered with his assistant. "Ready for some beautiful photos, Sarah?" he asked with a warm smile. James had been recommended by 3 different friends, and his portfolio was filled with stunning wedding photography that captured both the formal elegance and candid emotions of the day. As they moved through the suite taking pictures, Sarah felt completely at peace. The stress of planning, the last-minute vendor changes, and the family drama over seating arrangements all melted away. This was her day, and everything was falling into place exactly as she had envisioned. Her mother appeared in the doorway, tears already forming in her eyes. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered. You look just like your grandmother did on her wedding day." She carried a small blue velvet box. "Something blue from your father and me." Inside was a delicate sapphire bracelet that matched Sarah's engagement ring perfectly. As her mother fastened it around her wrist, Sarah felt the weight of family, love, and tradition surrounding her. The bridesmaids gathered their bouquets of white roses and lavender, and Jessica did a final check of everyone's appearance. Everything was perfect. The weather was ideal, with a gentle breeze keeping the temperature comfortable. The caterers had arrived on schedule, and the florist had just finished the final touches on the archway decorations. Sarah picked up her cascading bouquet of white peonies, roses, and greenery. The flowers were fresh and fragrant, tied with ivory ribbon that matched her dress. Hidden among the blooms was a small charm with her grandfather's military insignia, a tribute to the man who had taught her father everything about honor and courage. As they prepared to leave the bridal suite for the outdoor photo session, Sarah felt nothing but joy and anticipation. She was about to marry her best friend, surrounded by everyone she loved most in the world. The day she had dreamed about for so long was finally here, and it was going to be absolutely perfect. None of them had any idea that in less than 3 hours, this perfect day would become the most dangerous day of Sarah's life, and everything her father had taught her about courage and survival would be put to the ultimate test. The outdoor photo session was magical. Sarah and her bridesmaids posed under the ancient oak trees, their laughter carrying across the perfectly manicured grounds. The photographer captured beautiful moments as they walked along the stone pathway that wound through the manor's gardens, their dresses flowing in the gentle afternoon breeze. David had finished his own photos with the groomsmen and was now safely tucked away in the groom's quarters, as tradition dictated they shouldn't see each other before the ceremony. Sarah could hear distant voices and occasional bursts of masculine laughter from the other side of the manor, knowing that David's college friends were probably sharing embarrassing stories and trying to calm his pre-ceremony nerves. Guests continued, arriving in a steady stream. Sarah waved from the garden to her aunt and uncle from California, who were snapping photos of the stunning venue with their phones. The valet parking service was working smoothly, with cars being directed to the designated areas while keeping the main entrance clear and elegant. The string quartet had positioned themselves near the ceremony site and was playing soft classical, pieces that drifted beautifully across the grounds. Sarah recognized Pachelbel's canon and smiled, remembering how she and David had spent hours choosing the perfect music for every moment of their special day. "Let's get some shots by the fountain," James the photographer suggested, leading them toward the centerpiece of the manor's garden. The marble fountain featured carved angels and had been a focal point of the grounds since the manor was built in the 1920s. Water cascaded gently from tier to tier, creating a soothing sound that added to the peaceful atmosphere. As they posed around the fountain, Sarah noticed a black SUV pulling up the main drive. It seemed slightly out of place among the luxury sedans and convertibles that most of their guests had arrived in. The vehicle's windows were heavily tinted, making it impossible to see who was inside. "Probably just another guest," Jessica said, when Sarah mentioned it. "Maybe someone's business car." The SUV parked near the main entrance, but nobody got out immediately. Sarah shrugged it off and continued with the photos. She was probably just being overly observant because of her excitement and nervousness. Back inside the manor, the catering staff was putting finishing touches on the reception setup. Round tables covered in crisp white linen surrounded the dance floor, each adorned with tall centerpieces of white flowers and flickering candles. The head table, where Sarah and David would sit with their wedding party, offered a perfect view of both the dance floor and the gardens through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The manor's event coordinator, Mrs. Williams, moved efficiently through the space, checking every detail. She had been planning weddings at Grand Oak Manor for 15 years and took pride in ensuring everything ran perfectly. The silverware was polished, the champagne glasses sparkled, and the elaborate cake stood ready for the evening's celebration. At 3 o'clock, guests began taking their seats for the 4 o'clock ceremony. Sarah's family filled the left side of the aisle, while David's family and friends occupied the right. The atmosphere was joyful and relaxed, with people chatting, taking photos, and admiring the beautiful setting. Sarah was back in the bridal suite for final touch-ups. Her makeup artist freshened her lipstick and added a light dusting of powder to ensure she would photograph beautifully. Her hair remained perfect, with not a single strand out of place despite the outdoor photo session. 15 minutes until showtime, Jessica announced, checking her watch. The bridesmaids lined up for a final group photo before they would make their way to the ceremony site. Everyone was glowing with happiness and excitement. That's when Sarah noticed the second SUV. Looking out the window toward the parking area, she saw another black vehicle with tinted windows pulling up beside the first one. This one was even larger, almost like a small bus. Both vehicles sat motionless in the parking area, their engines running. "That's odd," she murmured to herself, a small knot of unease forming in her stomach. "What's odd?" asked her cousin Maria, one of the bridesmaids. "Those two black cars. They've been sitting there for a while now, but nobody's gotten out." Maria glanced out the window. "Maybe they're waiting for the ceremony to start? Some people don't like to be early." Sarah nodded, trying to shake off the weird feeling that was beginning to creep over her. Her father had always taught her to trust her instincts, and something about those vehicles didn't feel right. But this was her wedding day. She was probably just letting pre-ceremony jitters get the best of her. The wedding coordinator knocked on the door. "Ladies, it's time. The processional will begin in 5 minutes." Sarah took a deep breath and picked up her bouquet. Through the window, she could see the guests had all taken their seats. The string quartet had transitioned to the prelude music, and David was probably making his way to the altar with his groomsmen at this very moment. Her father appeared in the doorway, looking distinguished in his dress military uniform. His chest displayed ribbons and medals earned through 25 years of dedicated service. Tears glistened in his eyes as he saw his daughter in her wedding dress. "You look absolutely beautiful, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Are you ready to become Mrs. Martinez Davidson?" Sarah had chosen to hyphenate her name, wanting to honor both her family heritage and her new marriage. She nodded, linking her arm through her father's. "I'm ready, Dad." As they made their way through the manor toward the garden entrance, Sarah felt a surge of pure happiness. All the planning, all the stress, all the small details that had seemed so important over the past year, none of it mattered now. She was about to marry the love of her life, surrounded by everyone who mattered to her. The bridesmaids had already begun their procession down the aisle. Through the open doors, Sarah could hear the beautiful strains of Canon in D floating across the garden. Guests were standing, turning to watch as each bridesmaid made her way toward the altar where David waited. Just as Sarah and her father stepped outside into the golden afternoon sunshine, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Doors of both black SUVs had opened simultaneously, and men in dark clothing were stepping out. Even from a distance, she could see they were carrying something in their hands, something that looked very much like weapons. "Dad," she whispered urgently, gripping his arm tighter. But the processional music was playing. Guests were standing and looking their way expectantly, and her father was focused on the ceremony ahead. He didn't hear the alarm in her voice over the sound of the quartet and the excited murmur of 200 wedding guests. Sarah watched in growing horror as the men began moving toward the ceremony area, their movements coordinated and purposeful. This wasn't a group of late-arriving guests. These were professionals, and they weren't here to celebrate a wedding. Her father's survival training kicked in as she quickly scanned the area, identifying exits, cover, and potential weapons. But she was wearing a wedding dress and heels, surrounded by 200 innocent people who had no idea what was about to happen. The last bridesmaid reached the altar, and the music changed to the bridal march. This was Sarah's cue to begin walking down the aisle toward David, who was standing at the altar with a huge smile on his face, completely unaware of the danger approaching from behind the seated guests. Sarah had to make a split-second decision that would change everything. Sarah's mind raced as she calculated distances and options. The armed men were still about 50 yards away from the ceremony site, moving through the parking area with military precision. Most of the guests hadn't noticed them yet because everyone was focused on the bride's entrance. "Dad, we have a problem," she whispered urgently into her father's ear. her voice barely audible over the bridal march. Colonel Martinez followed his daughter's gaze and immediately spotted what she had seen. His 25 years of military experience kicked in instantly. His posture didn't change. His smile remained in place for the benefit of the watching guests. But Sarah felt his entire body tense with alert readiness. "How many?" he asked quietly, his lips barely moving. "At least 12 that I can see. 2 vehicles. They're armed and moving toward the ceremony." Her father's eyes swept the area with practiced efficiency, taking in escape routes, cover positions, and the location of his son and the other military personnel in the wedding party. The groomsmen included 3 active-duty Marines and 2 Army officers, all men he had trained with or knew personally. "We need to get these people to safety without causing a panic," he murmured. "Can you make it to David and signal the boys?" Sarah looked down at her wedding dress and 3-inch heels, then back at the men who were now only 30 yards away and closing fast. In about 60 seconds, they would be in range to threaten the guests. There was no time for a subtle evacuation. "Dad, I need you to trust me," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Before he could respond, Sarah stepped away from him and did something that would shock every person at that wedding for the rest of their lives. She grabbed the hem of her wedding dress and ripped it, tearing away the bottom layer of lace and satin to give her legs freedom of movement. The sound of tearing fabric was audible even over the music, causing several guests in the back rows to turn and look. Then she kicked off her heels and ran. Not toward David and the altar like a traditional bride, but straight toward the approaching gunman. "Everyone get down!" she shouted at the top of her lungs as she sprinted across the manicured lawn. "Armed men, take cover!" The wedding guests erupted in confusion and panic. Some people dove under chairs, others stood frozen in shock, and many started running in different directions. The string quartet stopped playing abruptly, their instruments falling silent as the musicians scrambled for safety. David stood at the altar in complete bewilderment, unable to process what he was seeing. His beautiful bride, who should have been walking gracefully down the aisle, was instead running toward danger in a torn wedding dress, screaming warnings about armed men. The gunmen, realizing their element of surprise was gone, began moving faster. They spread out in a tactical formation that confirmed Sarah's worst fears. These were professionals, not random criminals. Their movements were too coordinated, too practiced. Colonel Martinez was already in motion, using his command voice to direct the chaos. "Military personnel to the front. Civilians move to the manor." His voice cut through the panic like a knife, and the trained servicemen in the wedding party immediately responded. David's groomsmen, still in their formal uniforms, moved with sudden purpose. Captain Rodriguez, the best man, started directing guests toward the manor building while Lieutenant Commander Park and Sergeant First Class Thompson moved to flank the approaching threat. But Sarah was already between the gunmen and the guests, running straight toward 12 armed men in nothing but a torn wedding dress. The lead gunman, a tall man with military-style short hair and tactical gear, raised his weapon when he saw her approaching. He probably expected her to stop, to cower, to beg for mercy like most civilians would do when faced with an assault rifle. Instead, Sarah did something her father had drilled into her during countless training sessions in the Texas Hill Country. She dove and rolled, using the slight slope of the lawn to her advantage. The gunman's shot went wide, the crack of the rifle echoing across the garden and sending wedding guests screaming in terror. Sarah came up from her roll in a combat crouch, her torn dress now barely covering her knees but giving her complete freedom of movement. The years of martial arts training and monthly visits to the shooting range had kept her body in peak condition, and all those lessons from her father about combat tactics were flooding back. The nearest gunman was only 10 feet away now, his rifle swinging toward her, but he made a critical mistake. He underestimated the bride. Sarah lunged forward, getting inside his weapon's effective range before he could bring it to bear. She grabbed the rifle barrel with both hands, using her momentum and his surprise to wrench it away from him. The weapon discharged harmlessly into the air as they struggled. Behind her, she could hear Colonel Martinez shouting orders and the sound of the military groomsmen engaging other members of the assault team. Glass was breaking as guests threw themselves through the manor's windows to escape, and someone was screaming for everyone to call 911. The gunman she was fighting was bigger and stronger than her, but Sarah had advantages he didn't expect. She was desperate. She was protecting everyone she loved, and she had been trained by one of the best soldiers in the U.S. Army. Using a move her father had taught her when she was 16, she drove her knee up into the gunman's solar plexus, while simultaneously twisting the rifle out of his grasp. He doubled over in pain and she brought the rifle stock down on the back of his neck, dropping him to the ground. "Sarah," David's voice carried across the chaos. He had finally processed what was happening and was running toward her, still in his formal military dress uniform. "Stay back," she shouted, spinning toward the next nearest threat. 2 more gunmen were advancing on her position, their weapons raised. This was the moment that would define not just her wedding day but the rest of her life. Standing on the lawn of Grand Oak Manor in a torn wedding dress, holding a rifle she had just taken from an armed attacker, Sarah Martinez realized that all the training her father had given her, all the skills she had learned but hoped never to use, were about to be put to the ultimate test. The little girl who had dreamed of a fairy tale wedding was gone. In her place stood a woman who would do whatever it took to protect the people she loved, even if it meant turning her special day into a battlefield. The real fight was just beginning. With the captured rifle in her hand, Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her. The panic and confusion faded, replaced by the focused clarity her father had trained into her during years of weekend survival exercises. She could almost hear his voice in her head. When chaos strikes, the prepared mind becomes still water. The 2 gunmen advancing on her position had made a tactical error by approaching from the same angle. Sarah used the marble fountain as cover, its solid stone structure providing protection from their return fire. Bullets chipped pieces of marble from the angel's wings as she positioned herself for her next move. Behind her, the wedding had transformed into something resembling a military operation. Colonel Martinez had taken command of the situation, directing the evacuation of civilian guests while coordinating with the servicemen in the wedding party. The groomsmen, despite being caught in formal wear, had fallen into combat roles with impressive speed. Captain Rodriguez had managed to get most of the elderly guests and children into the manor building, while Lieutenant Commander Park and Sergeant Thompson were engaging gunmen on the eastern flank of the property. The crack of gunfire echoed across what had been a peaceful garden just minutes before. Sarah could see David moving toward her position, but she also saw something he couldn't. A 3rd gunman flanking around the rose garden trying to get a clear shot at her fiancé. Without hesitation, she broke from cover and sprinted toward the threat. Her bare feet found purchase on the grass as she ran, the torn wedding dress flowing behind her like a battle flag. The years of maintaining her physical fitness had paid off. She moved with speed and agility that clearly surprised the attackers, who had expected to face panicked civilians, not a determined opponent. The flanking gunman never saw her coming. Sarah approached from his blind side, using the landscaped garden beds as concealment. When she was close enough, she used another move from her father's training arsenal, a takedown that combined surprise with leverage to bring down opponents, much larger than herself. The gunman hit the ground hard, his weapon skittering away across the stone pathway. Sarah secured it immediately, now armed with a 2nd rifle. Her wedding dress was muddy and torn. Her carefully arranged hair was coming loose, but her brown eyes blazed with fierce determination. "Sarah, get to cover," David shouted from across the garden. He had taken position behind an overturned table from the ceremony setup and was trying to direct her to safety. But Sarah could see something David couldn't from his position. 3 more gunmen were moving around the manor's south wing, trying to cut off the escape route the guests were using. If they succeeded, the civilians sheltering in the building would be trapped. She made a decision that went against every instinct David had about protecting the woman he loved, but perfectly aligned with everything Colonel Martinez had taught his daughter about duty and sacrifice. Instead of seeking safety, Sarah moved toward the greater danger, using the manor's landscaping. As cover, she worked her way around the building's perimeter, Ancient oak trees and ornamental shrubs provided concealment as she tracked the movement of the three gunmen attempting to surround the building. Through the manor's windows, she could see terrified wedding guests huddled together. Her grandmother was there, still clutching her purse and looking confused about why her granddaughter's wedding had turned into a war zone. Jessica and the other bridesmaids were trying to keep the children calm, while their lavender dresses were stained with dirt from diving for cover. The sight of her loved ones in danger ignited something primal in Sarah. These weren't just random targets to her. They were her family, her friends, the people who had come to celebrate the happiest day of her life. The attackers had turned her dream into a nightmare, but they had also awakened something in her that they clearly hadn't expected. She reached the south wing, just as the three gunmen were preparing to breach the manor's service entrance. They moved with professional efficiency, but they were focused on the building and didn't notice the bride in the torn dress approaching from behind. Sarah's father had taught her that in combat, audacity often trumped superior firepower. When outnumbered, he used to say during their training sessions, make them think you're the one with the advantage. She stood up from behind a decorative hedge and called out in a voice that carried across the grounds, "Looking for me?" Oh, three gunmen spun toward her voice, their weapons swinging in her direction. But Sarah had already moved, rolling behind a stone planter as their shots went wide. The brick wall of the manor absorbed the impacts, sending chips flying but keeping the people inside safe. What the gunmen hadn't realized was that Sarah's shout had accomplished two things. First, it had revealed their position to the other defenders. Second, it had drawn their attention away from the manor's windows, where Captain Rodriguez and two other wedding guests who happened to be off-duty police officers had taken position. Crossfire that erupted caught the three gunmen completely off guard. Trained as they were, they hadn't expected to face coordinated resistance from what should have been a soft target full of unarmed civilians. Sarah used the distraction to advance on the nearest gunman's position. Her torn wedding dress was now completely unrecognizable as formal wear. It looked more like camouflage gear that had been through a tough training exercise. Her hair had fallen completely out of its elaborate style and hung loose around her shoulders. The gunman she engaged had military training, but he made a crucial mistake. He saw a young woman in a wedding dress and assumed she would be easy to handle in close combat. That assumption cost him dearly. Sarah's years of martial arts training had taught her how to use an opponent's size and strength against them. When the gunman tried to grab her rifle, she used his momentum to flip him over her hip, sending him crashing into the stone pathway with enough force to knock him unconscious. "Two down on the south side," she called out to the other defenders, using the tactical communication her father had drilled into her. From across the garden, Colonel Martinez's voice responded with pride and relief. "Copy that. Northeast sector secured." The sound of sirens was beginning to echo in the distance. Someone had managed to call for help, and law enforcement was finally on the way. But the immediate threat was far from over. Sarah could see movement near the main entrance where the black SUVs were parked. More figures in tactical gear were emerging from the vehicles, reinforcements that suggested this wasn't just a random attack, but a carefully planned operation. As she prepared to move toward this new threat, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in one of the manor's windows. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the bride who had been posing for photos just an hour earlier. Her wedding dress was torn and dirty, her face was streaked with mud and determination, and her hands gripped a rifle with professional competence. But her eyes still held the same fierce love that had brought her to this altar. Love for David, love for her family, and love for all the innocent people depending on her to keep them safe. The fairy tale wedding was definitely over, but the real Sarah Martinez, the woman her father had trained, the protector her family needed, the warrior hiding beneath the bride's exterior, was just getting started. The reinforcements from the SUVs moved with a coordination that confirmed Sarah's worst fears. This was a professional military-style assault, not a random attack. 6 more armed figures emerged from the vehicles, bringing the total number of attackers to what appeared to be a full squad-sized element. Sarah pressed herself against the manor's stone wall, using the building's architecture for cover as she assessed the new threat. Through her peripheral vision, She could see David and Sergeant Thompson moving to flank the newcomers from the eastern approach, while her father coordinated the defense from his position near the ceremony site. The sirens were getting closer, but law enforcement was still several minutes away. In a firefight, minutes felt like hours, and Sarah knew that the outcome of this battle would be decided long before help arrived. What puzzled her was the attackers' objective. They weren't behaving like typical criminals. They weren't demanding. Money hadn't tried to take hostages, and seemed more focused on causing maximum chaos than achieving any specific goal. Their tactics suggested military or paramilitary training, but their target seemed random, unless it wasn't random at all. As this thought occurred to her, Sarah remembered something that had been nagging at the back of her mind since the attack began. The black SUVs had arrived during the photo session, well before the ceremony started. They had been watching, waiting for the right moment. But waiting for what, or for whom? The answer came to her with chilling clarity as she saw one of the new attackers pointing directly at her father's position. This wasn't about the wedding. It was about Colonel Martinez. Someone wanted to eliminate a high-ranking military officer, and they had chosen his daughter's wedding as the perfect opportunity to catch him off guard. The realization filled Sarah with cold fury. Not only had these people attacked her wedding and endangered her guests, but they were specifically targeting her father. Everything she loved most in the world was under threat because of his service to his country. She keyed the tactical communication system her father had taught her, using hand signals to convey information to David and the other defenders. The Abu Dhabi message was clear. The primary target was Colonel Martinez, and they needed to adjust their defensive positions accordingly. David, despite having no formal combat training beyond basic military academy courses, was performing admirably under pressure. His business school education hadn't prepared him for warfare, but his love for Sarah and respect for her father drove him to fight with surprising effectiveness. Sarah watched as he and Sergeant Thompson coordinated a flanking maneuver that caught two of the attackers in a crossfire near the garden's eastern entrance. The sound of gunfire continued to echo across the grounds, punctuated by the breaking glass of windows and the splintering of wood as bullets found their marks. But the attackers were adapting too. They had realized that their target was better defended than anticipated, and they were beginning to use more sophisticated tactics. Sarah saw them deploying what appeared to be smoke grenades, trying to obscure their movements and confuse the defenders. The gray smoke began to drift across the manor grounds, turning the beautiful garden into an obscured battlefield. Visibility dropped dramatically, and Sarah knew that the attackers were using the cover to reposition for a final assault. She made a decision that would have terrified her family if they had known what she was planning. Instead of remaining in a defensive position, Sarah moved into the smoke cloud. Her father had taught her that sometimes the best defense was an aggressive offense, especially when facing superior numbers. The attackers expected the defenders to hunker down and wait for law enforcement. They wouldn't expect a bride in a torn wedding dress to launch a solo assault through their own smokescreen. Moving through the smoke required all of Sarah's training in stealth and fieldcraft. She used sound and movement to track the attackers' positions, staying low and moving carefully to avoid detection. Her bare feet were actually an advantage here. They made no noise on the stone pathways and gave her better feel for the terrain. The first attacker she encountered in the smoke never knew what hit him. Sarah used a sleeper hold her father had taught her, cutting off blood flow to the brain until the man lost consciousness. She secured his weapon and ammunition, then moved deeper into the gray cloud. The smoke was beginning to clear when she found what she was looking for: the apparent leader of the assault team, a man speaking into a radio and coordinating the final attack on her father's position. Sarah positioned herself behind a large oak tree, close enough to hear his communications. What she heard made her blood run cold. "Target is still mobile," the leader was saying into his radio. "Repeat, Colonel Martinez is still active. We need to finish this before local law enforcement arrives in force." The confirmation that her father was the specific target filled Sarah with a protective rage that overrode all other considerations. These people had invaded her wedding, terrorized her guests, and were now planning to assassinate her father. She stepped out from behind, the tree and leveled her rifle at the leader's back. "Looking for Colonel Martinez?" she said quietly. The man spun around, his weapon coming up as he turned. But Sarah had the advantage of surprise and superior positioning. Her shot was precise and controlled, disabling his weapon hand without killing him. "He's my father," she continued, her voice steady and deadly calm. "And you picked the wrong wedding to crash." The leader dropped his damaged rifle, clutching his wounded hand. For the first time since the attack began, Sarah saw real fear in an attacker's eyes. He was looking at a young woman in a destroyed wedding dress, but what he saw was a trained combatant who had just outmaneuvered his entire team. "Who sent you?" Sarah demanded, keeping her rifle trained on him. "Why are you after my father?" But before he could answer, the sound of approaching helicopters filled the air. Law enforcement had arrived in force with what sounded like multiple aircraft converging on the manor. The leader smiled despite his wound. "Too late," he said. "The operation was never about success. It was about sending a message." Sarah felt a chill of understanding. This attack wasn't meant to succeed. It was meant to demonstrate that military personnel and their families were vulnerable, even at their most personal and protected moments. But if that was the message they intended to send, they had seriously